Hello everyone, welcome to Cloud War. My name is Santiago. So in today's video, we will be working with Azure Functions once more. And in this case, we will be writing an Azure Function trigger in order to react to a service bus topic. So in order to achieve that, we are going to be creating the service bus trigger in the solution locally. We will be making a couple of adjustments throughout the code and making a quick walkthrough what we need to set up in order to make our topic work properly. Then we will be going back pretty fast to the AKS. We will be running once more the API locally using the port forwarding, and also we are going to be taking a sneak peek to the consumer locally. And the reason that we are going to be doing that is that when we move to the next step for testing the consumer, we will be sending a message throughout the API to our service bus. And I would like you to show you is that since we are working with a topic, both the consumer from AKS and also the Azure function with the new trigger are going to be getting the same message and they are going to be able to process it. Since we are keeping things pretty simple, in this case it's just going to be a pretty basic print into the console. So then we are going to be deploying the Azure function into Azure in this case with the new trigger that we created. And then we will be doing once more the testing in order to see that everything is working also after the deployment. Make sure when you are running this function locally or through Azure to have a proper identity set up in order to be able to access the service bus instance. In case you are not familiar with that, I will drop a link for the video where we explain what is managed identity and how to set up the roles. If you are just going to be working locally, just make sure that your user that is authenticated in the Azure CLI has the Azure Service Bus sender and receiver permissions to be able to use this locally without using any passwords or any credentials required for the standard authentication. So with that in hand, let's get started. Okay, now let's get started with the first step. So remember, when you are going through the PowerShell or the command or prompt that you are using, depending on the operating system that you're working on, just make sure that the console is exactly on the same solution and inside the project that you have your Azure function already defined. So once more, we will be using the func operator and the new action in order to create the service bus Azure function. In this case, the name that we are going to be choosing, it will be service bus consumer. From the template options, we are going to be choosing the service bus topic trigger. This is going to generate the C# code that is required for our solution. Now that the function boilerplate code has been created, we can go back into the IDE, into a code editor. And we will see that we have a new service bus consumer class in here that has the new Azure function. So if you remember, the function solution is a function app, and the function app could contain multiple functions. In this case, we have the old HTTP function that we created from the previous video, and right now we have the new one, which is the service bus consumer. So let's take a look. So as you can see, the code for the Azure function is pretty simple. In order to consume messages, it doesn't have anything like overcomplicated to set up. So everything that you need to have is, of course, the name of the topic that you would like to consume, the name of the subscription that you will be using to, and you will need to provide a name for the connection in order to be able to connect. So the name of the topic, following the example that we have previously, is billing. And the name of the subscription that we are going to be using is going to be Azure Functions. So remember that we created two subscriptions, one for the Azure function and another one for the consumer. But both of them are actually consuming the same message from the service bus throughout the same topic. For the name of the connection, we are going to be giving the name service bus connection. And from this, in order to work properly, we need to edit the local settings.json file. And what we need to do is to include the service bus connection underscore and the name fully qualified namespace. You need to make sure that this value is set up inside the values option, and you need to make sure that the structure of the name is exactly the same. The name of the string connection that you gave here into the code, underscore and the fully qualified namespace. This structure is specifically being used when you want to use role-based access control. That means an IAM account, your Azure account, or a managed identity. So once more, as you can see, we only need to provide the service bus namespace. We don't have to provide any shared keys or any policies or anything like that. Just make sure to give the namespace as it is. Pretty simple. With that, if we take a quick sneak peek into the code of the Azure function, we are only getting the message throughout the throughout the binding here. So we have the trigger, and throughout the binding we have the message that arrive with our solution, and with that message we are going to be printing the ID of the message, the content of the message, and also the content type of it. And after that we will be completing the message. So this is exactly pretty similar to the code that we already had in the consumer. So we take a look into the worker side. We have something pretty similar. We open a connection with the consumer. We get a message from the service bus once arrived. We take a look, a sneak peek into the body, and we print the content into the console, and we complete the message. So this code in the Azure function is another alternative or solution in order to comply with the same requirement, receiving messages from the service bus, in this case a topic, and process those messages. So let's take a look into the testing for our API and our consumer locally. So once more, let's execute the API locally using the kubectl tooling. So let's go back into the console. And in this case, I will be using a new PowerShell tab just to make everything isolated. And we are going to be using again the port forward command. And in this case, we will be forwarding the deployment producer API. We are going to be mapping this port in the 4200 locally from the port 8080 that is exposed in our deployment in the AKS side. So everything looks good. We have our listener set up in the port 4200 for the API. And also let's take a look into the logs for the consumer that we have. This is the pod that is executing on the Kubernetes cluster that is taking messages. But of course, before doing that, let's execute the Azure function locally as well, so we can also receive those messages in here. So once more, let's use the command func_start just to execute our function locally. So what we are going to see is that since we are starting the whole solution in the function app, we will see two triggers. We will see the HTTP that we created the last time, and we are going to be seeing a new one. This is, in this case, is the service bus trigger. It's pretty simple. So let's go back into the browser and let's test the API once more. So now that we are hitting the API exposed in the 4200 from the AKS cluster in our local environment using the port forward win, we can go to the billing endpoint that we have in here, and this is the one that writes messages to the service bus. Let's write the order ID 2000 and the billing ID 4000. Let's leave the data as it is and let's execute this code. So we get a proper response in here. So let's go back into the console and let's take a look. So as you can see, we already got our message on the Azure function with the order ID 2000 and the billing ID 4000. If I also go into the worker into the AKS cluster, you can see that we also receive the same message. So this is one of the huge advantages of working with topics. You can have multiple consumers throughout multiple subscriptions listening to the topic and processing those messages individually with different logic and doing something pretty different in each one of them. In this case, we are keeping things pretty simple just by printing the message to the console. But just think, as a developer, you can do whatever you want with the message once it's arrived to the consumer in AKS or to the Azure function, whatever suits more to your use case. Okay, so now in order to deploy the Azure function into Azure, we need to make a minor adjustment to the local settings.json in our local environment to make things pretty simple. So instead of using the Azure Web Storage locally, as we had on the previous configuration, we are going to be replacing that key with the Azure Web Storage _ account name. In here, just provide the name of the Azure Storage account that has been created already that you would like to connect with your Azure function. If you follow on the previous video when we set up the Azure function, we created also a storage account and we attached that storage account to the Azure function. So when you deploy an Azure function without giving any basic configuration into them, the Azure function is going to automatically use that storage account that you associated directly to it. In this case, since we are going to be provided the configuration by ourselves, just make sure to provide the name of the storage account. The reason that we are using this naming convention is because once more we are using managed identities in order to authenticate against the Azure services. So if we take a look into the managed identities that we created as well, remember that we need the Azure Service Bus Data Sender and Receiver in order to process those messages from the Azure portal, and I added a new one, in this case the storage blob data contributor, in order to be able to access the blob storage and be able to write and read blobs from it. So with this in hand, Let's go into the CLI and let's deploy the Azure function to Azure. In order to deploy the new Azure function into Azure, we will be using exactly the same command as before. We will be using the function of publish action in order to deploy to the CloudWork function the solution that we already have been working on. But in this case, we are going to be using a parameter for from the CLI, and we will be using the publish local settings. What this command is going to do, that is going to push the Azure function into Azure, and it's going to push the local setting.json that we just modified into Azure as well, using exactly the same keys that we just created. So let's execute this command, and we will be back in a moment when the process has been completed. Okay, now that the Azure function has been deployed and created in the Azure portal, I want us to explore something additional on the Azure portal. So I want you to locate your Azure function in the portal and go into the environment variables under the settings menu. In here you will find all the application settings that are set up for your Azure environment, and all of those are shared to the different functions that you already created. As you can see, we have ones like the account name and also the service bus fully qualified namespace in here were part of the local host settings that we synchronize as part of the deployment. I want you to use the add option and include two things, the Azure Client ID and the Azure Tenant ID. Make sure that you set up this name exactly as you see on screen, otherwise it will not work. What you need to add for the client ID, it will be the ID of the managed identity that you will be using to get all the permissions that are required to execute the code. And the tenant ID, it will be the tenant ID of your account that you are using. Just make sure to include those. So once you have this completed, we will be able to explore the Azure function. Prior to testing the Azure function, take a look into the function app under the overview, and you will be able to see that we have now two functions, the all HTTP function that we deployed previously and the new service bus consumer function. So let's use the log stream in order to connect to our function and see the output that is being written into the console. So this might take a few seconds depending on the results of the Azure function and your internet connection, but usually pretty quick. Okay, so we are now connected. Let's go back into the API that we are running locally from the AKS. Just remember, this is running on the AKS, but we are accessing locally using the port forwarding. Let's create a new message. In this case, let's say this is order ID 500 with the billing ID 4, and let's execute this command. We got a successful response in here, and if we go throughout the logs, you will be able to see that we are already getting those messages in here. So we got the message ID and we got the order 500 and the billing ID number 4. We also go back into the terminal, we will be able to see that we are still getting all those messages in the AKS cluster. So we have the order ID 500 and the build ID number 4. So on today's video, we learn how to deploy a service bus trigger into the Azure function, how to explore to it, and how do the initial setup to use managed identity. So that concludes initially this first stage of videos. So join me on the next session where we are going to be digging further into the Azure services and doing more exciting things. Thank you. See you in the next one.